Everybody, I'm Dan Holmes. I am in Denver, and I have been airbrushing for 20-ish years, something like that. And I don't consider myself an expert, just because I think there's always something that is new out there that somebody else can learn. But I've picked up an awful lot over the years, and I think I'm pretty decent with one. So today's class, we're going to go over how to use an airbrush. The last class was more on how to maintain it, but this crazy thing that can aerosolize paint and make all these neat effects and neat artwork. Well, how does it work? How do you use it? So first off, after you've got your air source set, your PSI set, all that kind of stuff, the best way to hold it is I hold mine like a pencil. And there's trigger style airbrushes and such, but I've just got these traditional button style, so I can't show you with the trigger. But anyway, there's a button up here. You press that down, get your air, pull it back to move the needle out on a double action airbrush. And depending on how far back you pull it is going to be how much the needle is going to move and how much paint's going to come out. Keeping the air on all the time is the best thing to do. So since you're holding that the whole time, you want to do this comfortably. Don't use the tip of your finger to press it down. That's going to fatigue you. Use the fat of the pad, and generally airbrushes have a dish or a slope or something like that to try to make it easier. So just use the little fat of the pad of your finger to press on that. You don't need to press very hard. It's generally quite light. And then when you pull back, if it's too much of a tension here, there's a spring inside that you can adjust. You turn. I'll show you on a different airbrush. You can adjust. Generally, you can adjust these back nuts right here that will reduce the tension on that spring and make that trigger easier to pull. And so just set that to where you like it. I've got a fairly light trigger on mine. Just because, after a few hours holding that, you're going to cramp up. So I've got a nice light trigger. If you, after a while, you may end up getting a little bit of a shake or something like that as your muscles fatigue. I end up having that problem. A lot of times what I'll do is I'll do a double-handed grip where I end up putting this hand over the front and just use that to help steady things. Excuse me. Use that to help steady things. And then, like I say, if you've got other ergonomic problems, there's a kind of an airbrush that has a trigger on the front. You end up just pulling that to turn your air on, and then how far back you pull that is also how far back the needle goes. Somebody reminded me of that yesterday. I haven't been talking about those. All right, so a couple of drills to start out with. This is calligraphy paper, Chinese calligraphy paper. It's Chinese or Japanese, I can't remember. Calligraphy paper. You can get it on Amazon. It reacts with water to show up. And so all you do is add a little water in here into your color cup. And then I've gridded it. I just added these grids. These are 1/2-inch lines. And I just use those as a way to find a target for what it is I'm wanting to paint. And you can just practice, like splatting, all that kind of stuff, and just try to get decent little dots and use it as a target too. Using those intersections as a target, you can use the inside as a way to practice getting up on a nice tight line, how to gradiate lines, etc. And just use this as practice. You can use that to practice the main 3 strokes. I got to get some water here. Hang on a second. I've done more talking over the last 3 days than I have in like the last year. So my mouth is really dry. There's three basic strokes with an airbrush. You've got a dot, you got a line, and you got a dagger stroke. The dot is pretty self-explanatory. You line up where it is you're wanting to go, keep your air on all the time, line up where you want to go, and just pull back gently until you get a nice well-formed dot. If your dots aren't well-formed, like if they do that, you know that you're either in too close, you know, that with that spider webbing or that splatting, you're either in too close, or your pressure is too high, or your paint is over thinned. There's a couple of different reasons that'll happen, because you've got a triangle with an airbrush. You've got PSI, you've got viscosity of your paint, and how close you are to your substrate. And so you've got, if you change one of those things, or you've got to adjust for that one variable using the other two to try to make that triangle straight. So if you're in too close, you can try to back out a little bit, but then the problem is if you're back out too far, you're not going to be able to get a nice tight line. To get your nice tight lines, you need to be in nice and close like that. You see those okay? And being this calligraphy paper, there we go. Being this calligraphy paper, the water dries very quickly. All right, so that's, anyway, the dot. That's how we do that. The line, keep the air on, pull the trigger back gently, and let it go back gently at the end of your line. If you hold and then move your line, you're going to get a barbell right there. And the same thing is that when you stop the airbrush, if you don't stop it at the same time as putting the trigger back, you're going to end up barbelling there too. Barbelling, spidering, what have you there. So you just try to practice to get a nice straight line. A lot of times you can test this out, whether you get a straight line up and down is easier for you, or this direction, whatever, and just be able to rotate whatever it is you're painting so that your straight line is this way. My straightest lines are when I go diagonally that direction.
And then somebody said, when using paint, does not being too far back also dry the paint before it contacts the model?
It can. Yep, absolutely. Because what's going to happen is you've got the distance here from here to your substrate, and that whole area that it's going, it's drying out during that. There's ways to combat that, but that is something to watch out for. And you can end up having it bounce off and fogging up your work area, overspray onto other things, etc. So you can combat that with going at a lower PSI, getting in closer, etc. If you may need to change the needle size if you need to stay in close and yet still get a larger coverage, etc. There's lots of different variables. And that's one of the reasons why I suggest you practice with something constantly. Last stroke is a dagger stroke. And the way that works is you gently, as you're moving your airbrush, you gently pull the trigger back, and then you gently push it back forward near the end of the stroke, and it'll end up tapering off. This is a really common stroke for doing hair or other like tentacles and things like that, as things that taper off. And it's a little bit harder to show because there we go. You can do double dagger strokes like that, where you end up having a tail like that as it goes off. You can do nice and small ones too, like that. That's probably the most common stroke right there for an airbrush. And the secret is just to be smooth with it. I try to do everything that I can smoothly with it to increase the smoothness of this. I put on nice, relaxing music, anything to try to get me into kind of a Zen mode where I'm working with this. But that dagger stroke ends up being the basis for so many things like these crescents that you do, and you can do them both ways. Loops and whirls, etc. for noodling. This is a really common one for doing veining on figures, etc. It's just those random loops and whirls. Works as camouflage on certain German aircraft, etc. So then after you're comfortable with water, water is obviously a very thin medium to paint with. And so it's not exactly paint, but it'll at least get you used to the various strokes and how things work. After you're done with water, you can move up to paints, and then onto other things. Now I take a piece of acrylic paper and do the same kind of thing with paint. And I use this in my previous class, but you do the same kind of thing, the dots, the lines, anything like that with paint. And you can experiment then on seeing how your real paint works and how to do that. Well, if you also end up getting bored with that, the other thing I recommend is to get a coloring book, and it's get a children's coloring book. Don't use an adult coloring book. One, they're quite a bit more expensive. I mean, these are only a couple of dollars, but the paper that's in these is really, really cheap, and so it's really it works really well when you are painting something, because it doesn't want to absorb the paint quite right, and so you've got to be real gentle with being able to get in there and try to be accurate with both your paint viscosity and your PSI on it. You can just practice coloring things in, and if you've ever got extra paint from trying to spray something, pull out a coloring book and practice on it, on trying to color various things in. Don't waste that paint. I mean, you know, we spend a lot of money on our models and our minis and things like that, and so it may seem like you're wasting paint by putting extra in a cup, but there's ways to use it up so it doesn't actually go to waste. It's useful. All right, so one of the other things somebody talks to me or has asked me about is what PSI to spray at. And I generally spray at a very low PSI because as I've said, that velocity of that air hitting something, it's going to want to bounce back. And if that paint is already dry, it's going to go out into the air, or it's going to land as dust on something else. It's going to be overspray, you know, like this, etc. So I generally spray at a very low PSI, somewhere between 10 and 20, depending on the airbrush, the thickness of the paint, etc. The thinner paints, I go a much lower PSI. I can show you what happens if you've got too high of a PSI. By the way, these are, I wear contacts. I have for years. So these are just old contact solution bottles that I just fill up with whatever it is that I need. I've got my cleaners, I've got water, etc. in them. All right, so crank the pressure up and then paint, and you see how it ends up just splatting real easily. And I can't control it as well because I got to start moving faster so that I don't have that splatting. But if I want that real nice control, I've got to go with a much lower PSI than that. Whereas if I can get a lower PSI, I can get in nice and tight and get in real small, fine line. And this is an Iwata Eclipse with a 0.35 needle. I think this is 0.35 needle. I'll have to check. It's either a 0.5 or it's a 0.35. And so that's about as fine as I can get with that needle. This harder and steam deck for the same setup, it may actually disappear before you can see it because it just doesn't spray out very much. This is a 0.15 needle in this. Yeah, see, even that, my pressure is too high on that. So I gotta turn my pressure down with this brush even farther. There we go. And even that's still a little high. But you can see I can get a nice fine line. And even that's still a little high. There we go. So I mean, this will do like a hairline, whereas this will do about the width of a pencil lead. There's the difference. Dump out my water. There we go. So that's one of the differences of PSI and air pressure. Let me get my air pressure back here. There we go.
Somebody asked, what is the smallest needle you use?
That Harder and Steenbeck one with the 0.15 needle. That's my smallest needle. Yeah, there we go. And again, it all depends on what I need. So like if I'm wanting to prime or base coat this figure, I'm not going to use my Harder and Steenbeck because it's not going to be able to produce a wide enough spray to make it worth doing this. So I'm going to use a larger needle. Also, your primers are generally thicker, and so you want to do a larger needle with that too. I usually spray a lot of my primers with like a 0.5 needle, just because they're thicker by design. All right, let's show how to thin some paint then. So you can get.
I was about to say you got two. I assume the smaller the needle, the thinner you have to make the paint.
That's exactly it. That's exactly it. So like this one's best for spraying inks.
And do you have a particular airbrush or compressor you recommend for starting out?
Yeah, I do. The airbrush that I actually recommend to start out with is the same one that I started out with, and that's the Iwata Eclipse. It's you can get a 0.35 needle for it. You can get a 0.5 needle for it. It's just a real workhorse airbrush. This is my first one, my first real airbrush I got. So it's over 20 years old, and it still sprays like the day I got it. It's just been bulletproof for me. I've never had to replace any parts on it except for needle and nozzle. It's just absolutely bulletproof. I think when I bought it, it was around 135. I think it's gone up just a little bit since then. I think it's around 150 now, but it's just an absolute workhorse airbrush. I get it from Tom Grossman at tagteamhobbies.com. His link is in my Artist Alley Discord. The Reaper Vex is also an outstanding brush to start out with. It's got a couple of things that I don't particularly care for about it, and that has to do with the way I use an airbrush. This little barbell back here makes it a little bit difficult to clean it sometimes, just because you got to remove the needle if you ever need to adjust anything on the inside here. Just because of this barbell, you can't pull the back end of the airbrush off, and then so conversely, you can't push the needle forward. It always has to come out through the back end. And so if you've got a booger or something like that on the front end of your airbrush, if you haven't cleaned that off, you can actually get that trapped in the body here. But this is a good airbrush to start out with too.
And you covered this in your cleaning, but there's a question: do you strip it down and clean it thoroughly after each session or between color changes?
I don't. Neither one. I actually only strip my airbrush down and clean it when something goes wrong. If it's not spraying right or something along those lines. And the reason for that is every time you take all of this apart, pull these parts out, there's metal on metal wear as you're moving things, and I try not to do that. So I actually only clean these things as a strip down, maybe about every 10 times I use one, 10 sessions or so. It just they don't need it. If you do a good change, do a good end of session clean, do good color change cleans, etc. You just don't need to field strip them unless something actually goes wrong. Also, I'm a bit of a klutz, but every time I pull this needle out, well, now I've got to be real careful with that needle. I got to be real careful with that nozzle so that I don't bend it, I don't drop it and get lost in the carpet monster, etc. So I actually try not to field strip these things as much as I possibly can. All right, so let's talk about paint. You can get real airbrush paint that is already made for it. Like Golden makes one that this says Airbrush colors on it, but they now call it, I think they're high flow colors. But it's already thinned and ready to go for an airbrush. Or you can get, just like Reaper paint and thin it down. Comart makes a airbrush ready paint. Garage Kits US Colors makes airbrush ready paints. Vallejo makes airbrush ready with their Game Air. They also just have their standard paints like this. I'll show you how to thin these. If you've already got these paints, I can show you how to thin these down to actually work in your airbrush without any trouble. I personally have moved, when I'm using an airbrush, I've moved over to these artist paints. The nice thing is they come in big bottles. I can get them easily. I've got a decent art store here. The bad thing is they all come in artist colors. So instead of a blood red, for example, I've got to get a naphthalene red and then adjust it from there. I've got to mix it from that. So you do have to end up learning a little bit of color theory. But Garage Kits US, they do make an awful lot of these are taxidermy paints, and they end up naming them with non-artist type colors. So this is like transparent poisonous yellow, and it's just kind of a greenish yellow. They make a lot of transparent paints. This is a tie-in brown, transparent Mars red, jet black, etc. Get those from Garage Kits Colors US.us. They're great paints as well. You can also spray inks, like I was talking about, P.H. Martin watercolor inks. The bad news with these radiant ones is they're dye-based, which means they're fugitive. They will not stand up to UV light. You want a pigment-based paint, ink, I should say. And so they make a hydrous line right here, and that's more of an actual pigment-based paint, and that won't degrade in sunlight or under fluorescent light, etc. But they already come nice pre-thinned. They work quite well. I use them for a lot of effects paintings and things like that. So let's show how to thin down. Set my airbrush over here. Let's show how to thin down some Reaper paint. Got my previous paint cups. I normally thin into bottles that I buy off of Amazon. These little plastic bottles. I think I get them for about 20 bottles for like $10 or something like that. I thin in these things, and I add a little stainless steel ball. And you want a genuine stainless steel. You don't want a coated ball. You want it all stainless steel, otherwise it will corrode or rust and have problems in there. So like a BB or something like that doesn't work. You can also use glass beads. I use a lot of those too, but you want some sort of an agitator in there to work for shaking things. Once you've mixed something up, if it's in this type of bottle, it'll last about a year or so before it's gonna catalyze up, because they are gas permeable. So it will eventually catalyze. You can also get glass bottles that have more of an O-ring on them, and they'll stay a lot longer. I save a lot of my paint bottles from my models. I use a lot of Tamiya paint and Testors paint, and so I'll save those and mix in those if it's something that I need for a while. But generally, I mix up enough that I'm only going to need it, maximum of a year, and away we go. But for this demonstration, I'm going to be mixing in this so that we can see what it is we're doing. To thin something as thick as Reaper paint, you want to use a thinner. There's Flow-Aid, which is it's a water-based thinner with some surfactant in it, which just means that it's going to be a little bit. I think the most common term is wetter, but it's just going to make it that much thinner and able to get in there and thin that paint better. This works up to about 25% thinning. So if you want to keep your paint opaque, this works really well to just thin it out to the consistency of about 2% milk. 2% milk is about where I start with for thinning with my Eclipse. I have to go thinner, obviously, with my harder and Steenbeck or my Badger Sotar, et cetera. But my Vex and my Eclipse is great for about 2% milk. And so that's one of the reasons why I specifically say 2% milk is paint is different all over the place. You know, white paint is generally thicker than a different color than like yellow paint, for example. And so I always say 2% milk. So I don't say, you know, X number of drops of this, X number of drops of that. So anyway, I use a Flow Aid. Golden makes some, Liquitex makes some, Reaper makes some. You can find it as Flow Improver. Vallejo makes some. Flow Improver, Flow Aid, something. Look for the keyword of flow. And when I use that, I also add a drop of Slow Dry. You're not gonna be able to see that very well on the camera. I use a drop of Slow Dry also, and that all that is it's an acrylic retarder that just keeps the paint from drying so much, and it'll combat tip dry. When you're spraying stuff, that paint wants to adhere to anything that it's in contact with, and so that can be the top of your the end of your airbrush, etc. And so you add a little bit of the Slow Dry, and it'll just make it a little bit slicker and doesn't dry on the end of the tip there. Look for retarder, slow, something along those lines. Like I say, Golden makes some, Liquitex makes some, etc. I try to stay in the same brands, manufacturer's brands. So when I'm spraying Golden paints, I try to stick with Golden's Flow Aid and Slow Dry, etc. For this demonstration, I'm just going all over the place because I've got more of Liquitex Slow Dry than I do Golden Slow Dry left, for example. So it just depends, but I try to stay with that manufacturer because that manufacturer knows their paint best, and whatever random magic and unicorn fart they throw in this to get it to do its work, it is just more compatible with that particular brand. And I do not have loyalty to one brand of paint over another. You just understand what all of them can do, and as long as you do it right, you can get them to do anything you're looking for. So I don't have any one brand that I like. I think they all do a little bit different job, and so you just understand what they are. For example, the Comart paint sprays beautifully, but it's really fragile, and you can wash it off with water. Now, one of the benefits of that is that if you screw something up, you can just put it under the sink and it washes right off. On the bad news with that is that it's very fragile. Garage Kits US, it's also fragile. You can actually just wipe it off with a finger. Like this is a bus that I primed probably about 2 months ago or so, and I just haven't been able to get back to it. And I can just, on the primer itself, I can still just wipe it off with my finger. So you can just see that it's very fragile stuff. It's wonderful. It sprays very thinly and goes down beautifully. It's just fragile.
Somebody asked, how do you use reducer / thinner versus Flow Aid?
So I'm going to get to that next. So as I said, 25% of Flow Aid is about the maximum that you can use on these thicker paints. If you need to go thinner than that, then you need to move to a extender, reducer, medium. Look for those keywords. Like this is a transparent extender. There's an airbrush medium here, etc. And the reasoning for that is when you add that much water to the acrylic binder in here, is going to actually lose its integrity. It's not going to be able to adhere quite as well to what it is you're painting. And then these mediums are an actual acrylic polymer in there, and they're just a replacement for the binder. They just don't have any pigment in there, so they'll extend out the paint without actually affecting the integrity of the paint film. All right, so like I say, about 2% milk, and we're going to make this opaque paint. I'm going to show you how to really thin this stuff down to make it opaque. So squeeze out, and like I say, I always squeeze out more than I think I'm going to need. We spend enough money on our models and stuff. No use of wasting paint. And so then this transparent extender is about 50-50 or so, maybe a little bit more. And then I take a micro brush. Where did my micro brush go? That I've been using. There it is. And I just end up stirring it up. And you can see it'll shift the paint a little bit, but not too much, especially when it dries. It makes it a little lighter when it's wet, but you can see the dried stuff right there is pretty close to what the original color is. And then the way I judge on how thin it is I just go it up the side here, and if it runs back down easily, then I can kind of see. So I'm going to thin this just a little bit more. If you use these extenders and reducers, etc., you generally don't need to add any slow dry. It's already got that magic in it. And so you can see just that little bit of paint that I squoze out ends up becoming that much paint when you add in all this reducer. And yeah, these are already gunked up and such, but they're from my previous class. But they're dry. They'll be okay. We shouldn't have too much paint. If you end up making it too transparent, you can add a little bit of white. White is a really good opaquing paint. And then I always spray just a little bit in an area just to see how I'm doing. And we'll just go over this section right here. And you can see how it sprays nice and transparently. Well, I got a little bit of splatter right there. I must have a booger on the end of my brush here. Yeah, just a booger. There we go. You can see it's just a nice transparent color. I end up using transparent paints for most of my airbrushing because I end up layering everything rather than blending everything. And so you can go in there nice and tight, get various effects with your opaque paints, and then go in and go over it with a modulating transparent color overhead. Any questions so far? Is all this making sense to everybody?
Looks like it so far. They're saying yes. Yes, indeed.
Good. All right, so now we're going to show how to do a color change. And yes, I ended up wiping that out rather than spraying it out like I should have, but you don't have enough time for me to sit here and do all of my practice. But at this point, that's where I pull out a coloring book and play around with it. All right, so how to do a quick color change. Take your color jar. They're spray out jars. This one's made by Sparmax. You can get it through Iwata. Badger makes one, etc. So anyway, you just stick it in there. Take a cleaner that is compatible with whatever it is you're spraying. So I've been spraying acrylics, so I use a cleaner that will break down that acrylic binder. It's made to destroy it. This happens to be Easy Air. Iwata makes one. Badger makes one, etc. Do test some of these on paint outside of your airbrush. For example, Vallejo paint, even after you've reduced it and all that kind of stuff. If you use Iwata's cleaner, it reacts with the vinyl that's in that paint and just turns it into almost a semi-solid mess. So I end up just taking this, swirling it around, and then spray it out. This is getting full here, so I need to turn on my spray booth. Save my remaining brain cells. I've got a Wi-Fi enabled outlet on my booth, so do that a couple of times. Just kind of use this micro brush to get in there. You don't need to really be completely clean, because I mean the little minuscule bits that you're going to get in there really aren't going to shift your color too much. I also, after I use the cleaner, I do spray out water, just because since this is designed to eat the binder, I want to have water in there instead to not eat that binder. So I do just spray out just a little bit of water.
And someone asked, does your compressor have a tank or is it tankless?
My compressor is tankless. I use an Iwata SmartJet Pro.
And then if you are using an acrylic quote unquote destroyer to clean your airbrush, how do you make sure it doesn't affect your next color?
Well, that's why I put water in there, is to get that all flushed out of there. Get it all flushed out. Raise that up just a little bit. All right, and so now we're ready to spray the next color, and it can be just about any color out there. I said that if you've got a little bit of residual color, you don't really generally need to worry about it. The only caveat I'll give with that is if you're then going to spray white, because even just a little bit of color in there will affect white, especially if you've got either red or blue. They seem to affect white quite a bit more. So I do go through just a little bit more if I'm going to be spraying white as my next color. There are, like I said, airbrush ready paints already. Let me spray something that's not transparent here. So this is a jet black. I squirt just a little bit of that in there. That's the other problem with these particular bottles that garage kits use, is they clog up nicely. And so you notice I didn't do any thinning or anything like that. That's straight out of the bottle. And it's ready to go. And it sprays very nicely. I mean, you can pull real fine lines out of it, or you can get nice thick lines out of it too. I like the garage kit paints an awful lot. All right, let's do another color change. We'll talk about effects, brisket, stuff like that. But like I say, I just kind of agitate the color in the cup. Just to make sure that the cleaner gets everywhere. And then I spray water. And since I'm using that contact bottle, I use it to kind of spray around the top of this color cup, so that I know that I'm flushing out all of the cleaner. All right. Make sure we're or empty. All right. All right, so there's different materials you can use to mask and try to get different effects and such. And I talk a little bit more about this in my other class, but there's various tapes out there that you can get. The Tamiya tape and the 3M orange tape. It's a delicate surface tape. These won't lift up your previous layers. They're a very low tack. The Tamiya is made out of rice paper, so it's very, very thin. I'm not sure what the 3M tape is made out of, but it's pretty thin as well. But make sure you get the orange color. The standard stuff is a lot more aggressive. This is made more for house paint. This is labeled as a delicate surface paint. You want to make sure that, at least on this stuff, you want to make sure that you pull it off within about a week. Otherwise, the adhesive can affect the paint underneath. I've had problems with that. And I use a lot of shields too. You can go to the fabric store and get like tulle and lace and all kinds of things like that. And I end up just using that to do various things. Like my previous class, I had sprayed blue. You lay that stuff down and then spray blue over it, and you've got instant lizard scales. You know, you can use any color you want, of course, but just the effect is instant lizard. Or the tulle, you lay it down, you can get instant asphalt or tire tracks, et cetera, depending on the effect you're looking for. If you spray with the airbrush at this kind of an angle, then it's not going to have a hard edge at the edges that are close to you. It's going to be more of a feathered edge because that paint is skipping over that first little edge right there. If you spray straight down, it's going to have much more of a harder edge when you lay it down. This also works really well for like fish scales, things like that. It's a nice tight weave. There's another product out there called Frisket. Is there a question?
Yes, actually, there is. What could I be doing wrong if I have paint drying on my tip fairly quickly? Is it just that I need to be adding the retarder? I don't currently own any.
The retarder will help, and you can also reduce your pressure because it, again, as the paint is leaving here, when it's mixed with the air, that's going to start the drying process immediately. And so the retarder will help keep it together and not drying as much. But if you also reduce your pressure, then you're not going to have quite as much air going in there to dry it out. All right, so there's a Frisket film. And what that is, it's a vinyl adhesive with a paper backing. And you can kind of draw on here of whatever kind of curve you're looking for, or a shape, or anything like that, or even spray with this shield. And you got your mask then, where you can then go in and cut out the areas. The best way to cut it out is with a swivel knife. What that means is you've got a knife that is on a swivel. It moves back, it moves around depending on what direction you're dragging it. And on this is a Frisket cutter. I'm not entirely sure who makes it, but I know you can find it if you just search Frisket cutter. But you turn this in and out to move that knife blade in and out just enough to cut the vinyl. You don't want to cut the paper, but you just cut the vinyl itself. And then you can reuse this, because when you put it back on, you can put it back onto that paper and save it for the next time around. All right. Let's see. I think that's about all I had with freehand or with stenciling. Freehanding, like I'd said earlier, there were all kinds of different shapes that you can make with those noodles and the lines and things like that. So when you freehand all of that kind of stuff, that you can get nice tight lines on it with a single feathered edge when you use, oh, I got other stencils. I'll show you real quick. Let me go back to that. Where did they go? They sell them? That's why I didn't see them.
Somebody asked, can you demo a smooth blend?
Yes, I can. I generally, like I said, I generally don't blend. I generally paint in layers, but I can show you. So you can get these shields that are various lines and things like that. And so you can just also hold those, and then getting your various lines along that line. And then same thing, you can get other things that are just kind of an interesting texture. Again, lay them down, spray whatever colors you're wanting to do, etc. So let's do a blend. I'm going to show you how to actually do a blend with transparent paint first. Let me grab it. Grab a clean sheet of paper. Where is the rest of my paper here? Here it is.
And somebody said, I'm getting speckling until I boost my PSI up to a bit above 30, even if I'm adding a lot of reducer and it barely comes out close to 20. Could this just be related to my brand of airbrush or compressor?
It shouldn't be. It's if it's not coming out until that, it's definitely you got to reduce it even more. There's something there that's keeping it from going down. Try, like I said, go thinner than 2% milk.
And then did you, or you did not detach the True Fire shields, question mark?
Yeah, and it's just because I haven't used them yet. So I didn't pull them apart. That's all. I've got them, I've just never used them. What the True Fire shields was that plastic shield that I showed earlier. I've got other shields that I've used more. That just happened to be the one that I just grabbed. All right, so let's get a nice base coat of red. And we're going to go back and forth on this red quite a bit to kind of opaque it a bit. Yeah, I'm speckling it a bit, but that's okay. Yeah, I must have a chunk in this brush or something like that, because it's speckling much more than it should. I wonder if I've got a bent tip. I was using this to demonstrate how to fix a needle, and I wonder if I just didn't polish it enough. I might switch out with the Bex. Get a little bit more. Yeah, you know what? I'm just going to clean this, and then I'm going to switch out with the Bex. I must have a bent needle.
It was a little bit out of camera too. Couldn't quite see it.
Yeah, good. Good, because it wasn't working right. All right, so I'm going to do an end of session clean on this one, because I'm going to change out to my other airbrush. So this one, I use a little bit stronger brush. This is a Q-tip. I use actual real Q-tip brand. They don't seem to shed nearly as much as off-brand Q-tips. And I'm just a little bit more aggressive with my cleaning. Make sure I get up on the bowl, etc. I use Q-tips. I'll use a lot of different things. I'll use my wife's toothbrush, get in there and clean with it. Just get a little bit more aggressive, that's all. I'll clean the front end of the brush a bit more. Yeah, I was using this this brush to demonstrate how to fix a bent needle, and I'm guessing I've got to polish at the end of it a little bit better. In the last class.
No answer there, but so that somebody said sometimes you want to see when an airbrush doesn't work properly as an example. And
Yeah.
somebody said,
Yeah,
why?
so
It's
that's a good example of, you know, either I've got a little bit of a bent needle, I've got a booger on the end of it, I've got something in there, maybe a little fog, something along those lines. But that's why that speckling is showing up. I don't know if you can see. Yeah, there you go.
we can see it. Yeah. And somebody said, why do you use your wife's toothbrush to clean it? How does she feel about that? There it is.
What she doesn't know won't kill her. I use non-toxic things.
She gets aggressive. Rainbow teeth.
That's right. All right. Can you see that okay?
Yeah, we can see that better. Much better. Much better. There we go.
I got to change my pressure a little bit. There we go. All right, so I'm just going to spray this. I know it's transparent, but we're going to try to opaque it as much as possible. And I'm not being super careful with it. I'm just kind of going straight down with it. I'm just kind of coloring in. Oh, I got a quality on that too. When you do these long sessions like this, you'll end up getting, if you don't notice when I thinned all of this stuff, I'm really paying attention to doing long-term effects. So I'm just kind of doing it by feel more than, there we go. All right, so we've got kind of a base of red there. Let's let that dry for a second while I do another color clean out. And I'm going to dump the rest rather than use it, even though I should use it. I'll show this on paper, and then I'll also show how to do some of these layering tricks on a figure, that King of Hell figure that we were talking about earlier.
I said, what would be the smallest mini size you'd be willing to use an airbrush on, ignoring the base coat, i.e. details or blends?
Well, probably about 12 millimeter. I find it faster to paint a lot of those with a hairbrush, but I can do it with an airbrush. I've done that kind of stuff as a challenge to myself. But My spray out cup's starting to get kind of full too. So I'm gonna dump this. Do as I say, done as I do. Oh, yeah, that's getting really full. New micro brush. Notice I'm doing the exact same thing I do with the outwad. I just spray it out. Getting really full. All right. Spray out some water. Let's do the same thing with blue now. And so we'll just kind of blend it from purple to blue.
Somebody
Red to
said,
purple to blue.
I noticed you're using tap water. Would you recommend distilled water?
I generally use distilled water. However, for just spraying out stuff like that, I just use tap water. When I'm mixing, I generally use distilled water. So like my flow aid, wherever it went here, it's got distilled water in it. But I just use tap when I'm cleaning. Oh, here's my blue. And so my blue is a Vallejo. And we're going to end up doing the same thing. We're going to make it transparent. And same thing as before. Squeeze some out. Where'd my airbrush transparent extender go? My booth is getting too full. I need to start pulling things out. But like I do have a distilled water bottle.
Somebody, how do you dispose of the stuff in a full spray jar?
What I do is I've got a large mason jar that I end up putting this in, and when the mason jar gets full, I end up taking it down to the hazardous waste recycling facility. Actually, what I do is I fill up several of them to make it worth it. Hiding behind the paper. Since I know there can be paint thinner and there can be lacquer thinner in here, depending on what I'm painting. This weekend, it just happens to have just water in that cleaner, but it's still not something I want in our water supply. So I take it to the hazardous waste recycling facility. Yeah, that's about right.
And they asked, have you sprayed lacquer through your airbrush?
Oh yeah. Yeah, I use a lot of lacquers for primers. If I'm doing cars where you want a super glossy finish, then I'll spray lacquers out of that. And I've heard people say that they like to have separate airbrushes between lacquer and acrylics. I'm not that rich, so I don't bother. All right, so let's do it backwards. So we go blue. And then start fading it into purple. And if you need to go more, end up spraying some more red on there. But you can see how it's transitioned into purple, where the blue and the red mix. And just depending on how much how much of it you want to get in there. Like I said, this was just quick and dirty doing this, just as a demonstration. But depending on how much of that you got, you can just keep on going. Now, if you use artist paints, you generally have to worry about the paints being warm or cool. There's a warm color and a cool color for everything out there. Since they're natural pigments, there's no true red, there's no true blue, there's no true yellow, etc. They can get close, but not true. And so that everything tends to trend one direction or another, warm or cool. And so as I'm spraying this out, I'm going to see if I can explain this. So if you think of a color wheel, and Taylor can attest to this, normally I'm doing the hand wavy stuff, but I want to clean this out while I'm talking. If you think of your color wheel, that you all remember from elementary school, you've got red, blue, and yellow on it, and depending on how much you mix those is where your next color is. So if your color though is, say, a warm blue, it's going to be a little closer to red than the cool blues that are going to be over towards the other side, the yellows. I think I might have that wrong. I'm probably talking differently while I'm doing two different things here. Warm is trending towards blue, or I'm sorry, warm is trending towards red, cool is trending towards blue.
And somebody
Anyway,
oh
yeah, I'm probably going backwards here.
That's all right. They said, would you spray across the page instead of directly at it?
Spray across the page or directly at it. Oh, you mean
instead of directly at it?
You mean like this?
Oh,
then
I'm not sure.
Instead of like that?
Oh, yes.
Okay, so if you spray like this, if you're angled down, then you're going to have it's going to be a lot harder to control because you're going to have a lot of spray coming out. Let's see if I can do this in the camera. So your spray is going to hit right here, and it's also going to hit all the way down here, but it's going to hit at different velocities because it's going to be slowing down as it travels more. It's going to drop, et cetera, due to gravity, due to air, et cetera. So I always spray directly at what it is I'm trying to go for, unless I'm using one of those shields where I'm trying to do a special effect or something along those lines. But if I'm doing freehand, I always go straight at.
Is it not parallel, but say 45 to get a blend?
You can. I always just spray straight on. Again, it's easier for me to think in that straight on. All right. Now we're cleaned out. All right. So let me go back and explain that bit with the color wheel. And I'll do the hand wavy bit. So you've got your color wheel. If you've got a color that is trending more to one side than the other, and you start mixing those colors, the color wheel isn't just the outside of it. The color wheel is also a center, and as you move towards the center, you're going to have more of a gray. And so if you've got a warmer color over here and you got a cooler color over here, and you start mixing those, they're not going to make a color that's at the top of the color wheel. It's going to be closer into the center of the color wheel, and so it's going to be more of a grayish, duller color. If that's what you're looking for, that's great. But if you're trying to stay vibrant, you want to try to mix as close to the outside edges of that color wheel as you possibly can. It's kind of a hard concept to explain. There's a really good book out there by a guy named Stephen Quiller called Color Choices. I've got a link to it in Amazon link to it in my Discord, my Artist Alley, where he goes in and explains this stuff a lot better than I can. In fact, there's 3 books on color that I recommend. I recommend that Color Choices. I recommend another book by Betty Edwards called Just Color. And then a 3rd book is by a guy named Joseph Albers, who in the 1800s studied a lot of this stuff. And it's called The Interaction of Color. And so what you see when you've got these blends like this, where you're layering these paints on top of each other, the light, as it's hitting, the way you see light is it hits something and then it bounces off. Well, depending on how far that light's able to penetrate those objects is what you can see underneath, those layers, I should say. And so when you're using transparent paints, you can actually get them to blend through that transparency rather than trying to blend in your cup and trying to get it that way. This is where the power of your airbrush is going to come through, is in this layering rather than trying to blend necessarily opaque paints, but using all of these transparent paints to try to blend things. That's where the real magic happens with an airbrush, is layering those transparents and such to do those blends, because you're going to end up having, if you look, you end up having a nice soft edge where everything, let's see if I got it. You end up having a nice soft edge here where everything just starts blending together. I was pretty heavy-handed with it because I wanted to be able to make sure that it showed up on this camera. But if I wasn't so heavy-handed, it'd transition a lot lighter. And then you can also go back over it again with red and get it to transition again too. So I mean, that you can layer many times. And each time you layer, though, you do have to pay attention to what you're doing on that color wheel. Otherwise, it's going to all trend towards mud, grayish brown. That's been actually that was a difficult lesson for me to learn for many years. I had a friend of mine that tried to challenge me to figure some of this stuff out. That's what sent me down this whole color theory boondoggle. Let me put that away. And we can end up doing the same kind of thing on an actual figure. How are we doing on time? We got plenty of time. So you got a king of hell figure here. These are bones. I generally prime everything. And I use a couple of different kinds of primer. I use Stynel Res. I use this Vallejo surface primer. I use a lot of different kind of primers. I use a lot of Gunzi Sangio's Mr. Surfacer. That's a lacquer. It's a pretty hot etching primer. I prime everything just because I like, when you're spraying something like this, you're relying on mechanical adhesion for the paint to actually stick. And so that primer, depending on what it is I'm painting, that primer can be a little bit hotter and can actually etch itself into that surface and then provide you that mechanical advantage that you're looking for with your paint. So I prime everything. However, I haven't primed this because, well, I just didn't have time. So we're not going to, but again, that's a do as I say, not as I do thing. I'm going to show some of these layers here. Let's do a base coat of muddy brown. That's not the right one. Where's my muddy brown? There it is. My Reaper muddy brown. And I think what I've been mixing stuff in is right underneath here. Look at it in the cup. And this one, we want to stay opaque. So we're going to actually just use the flow aid and the slow dry to do this one. All right, so it's right there. Take your flow aid. Get a little bit more paint in there. I got more to mix up. I need to find my pokey tool. Not sure where it went. I thought it was on top of my booth, but. And out of the bottle, this one's quite a bit thinner than some of the other Reaper paints, but I still thin everything. Yeah, I think we're about good. Let's add a couple of drops of slow dry. So like I said, I use this flow aid and these slow dries, even in my hand brushing. In fact, these small bottles are actually out of my hand brushing kit that I take to various cons. When I'm actually painting, I've got these giant bottles that I mix up. So the smaller bottles show up on camera better. All right. And yes, again, I'm using dirty stuff here, but it's okay. We can get some interesting blends with some of these little bits of paint that are going to trend towards each other, etc. So I use a little wheel here. It's made by Tammy. It's called a spray workstation, and it's just got these little alligator clips fit on real nicely, and so you can hold on to something while you're painting it. And then we're just going to cover this thing. So we're not even going to really be accurate. Doesn't matter. We're just going to just color it in just like a pencil. Oh, I guess I'm not painting low enough. Let me adjust my camera to be higher here. Sorry about that. So I'm just closing it on because we really don't care. We're going to have multiple layers on here, so it's really not going to matter whether we're super accurate or not. All right. Now we set that to dry right there. And again, since we didn't paint very thickly, there's a little spot right there that's a little thicker. It'll only take just a little bit to dry. So. That other jar is getting pretty full, so I'm going to use this other older jar to spray out into. The Vex doesn't go all the way in. Interesting. All right, well, do it the harder way. And again, I'm not going to be too tough on cleaning this out because we'll get other stuff in there. As this jar is getting full, it's getting spray back onto the body of these airbrushes. So I gotta grab another paper towel. Off the front end. All right. Now that's pretty dry. Dry enough for our purposes, I think. Let me move everything out of here. Let's you know what we're gonna do? We're actually gonna change our brushes. I want to show you guys spraying inks. Let's change over to my harder and Steenbeck. Get back to these hydrous inks here. And these are transparent colors as well. Let's see what we can do. Here's a phthalo blue. Let me shake it up a little bit. All right. And then again, since this guy atomizes so much, I only need a few drops. Let me make sure it gets down in there. There we go. Now, since this is new, let's test it out on our paper to make sure we're getting a decent spray. And there we go. That's showing up on camera okay too, isn't it? Yep. Good. All right, so now let's take our figure. We're going to end up doing is just all kinds of little noodles around here. Random. This is the fun part. It's just, you're just graffitiing it up. All right, nicely random. Let's do some on the other side here. Looks about right. Yeah, that looks pretty random to me. And this watercolor ink will dry in seconds, especially that thin. There's just nothing to it. Phthalo blue is a really nasty color in that it stains. It just one of those colors that is just really tough to get out of anything. So a lot of times I just end up having to wipe it out. And that I've got that thing full. I should dump it out here. I should take a second to dump that. My mason jars in another room, but so I'll dump it into this container. Assuming I can get it open. There we go. to be delicate so I don't drop anything. And then not only will my wife be upset with me for using a toothbrush, she won't be happy with me for staying in the carpet. So I'll just set that over there. And that's okay. All right, let's finish cleaning out. Another reason why I wear gloves for everything is a bit of a klutz, a bit of a mess. This little paint cup just can't hold enough cleaner in there to really get in there and clean everything between color changes. So we're going to end up having to rinse this quite a bit with the water. Make sure it gets it all down there. All right. Get the next color. How about a yellow? And you don't have to use these colors, of course. I'm just trying to pick bright colors that'll show up on camera easily. I've got no tie to them or anything like that. Now, I don't know if you saw it or not, I got a little bubbling on there. What'll happen if you've got bubbling in here, air wants to go out its main path and the path of least resistance. And so if the air normally wants to go out that way, if it's got bubbling, that means there's something that's making it easier for that air to come up this way. Either this isn't tight enough or you've got a clog here. This particular airbrush, this is generally just not tight enough. And it's not like that with every airbrush, but that one, yeah, it is. All right, so we got a little bit spraying out. So now we just start doing these noodles here, and they're going to be a little bit tougher to see just because this is a transparent yellow. So I'll show up a little bit. Mostly what they're doing is going to be modulating this blue to green. That's most of what their job is. Because they're also not going to show up in our top coat very well, but the green will. See how that, can you see how that changes to green? Is that showing up on camera okay?
Yeah, I can see it pretty well.
Okay. All right, let's do a couple more colors. Let me get something to show up a little bit better. Do the top coat I was planning on was going to be yellow, or I'm sorry, it was going to be red. Let's play around something else. Maybe do that yellow is a really weak color, so I only need to do one flush with the cleaner. It ate it right up. All right. Is this interesting to people? Are you guys getting something out of it? I'm kind of winging it here, so tell me if you are or not.
There's a bunch of yeses.
Okay.
And I mean, this is your highest amount of people right now, so that's good.
Oh, okay. Let's do a black so it actually shows up pretty well on camera. I never know what people find interesting and what they're not going to. I mean, I'm just kind of Bob Rossing it up right here.
And somebody said waiting to see the final results of the color layering.
So let's do some real fine black lines in here. This might be too fine to show up on camera. This is super fine. We can use that also to shade along in here a little bit. Got my shake starting up here. That black showing up at all, or is that too fine? Well,
I think we can see it. I can see it.
Okay.
Looks like it.
A little bit heavier so you can see it. I worry about what can show up on camera versus what couldn't. Yesterday, I was having problems. My camera was set for low light mode, so there was an awful lot of glare yesterday. I don't know what's showing up and what's not. I'm not really being all that careful. I mean, these are organics, so it really doesn't matter. You know, nothing in nature is straight. There's no straight lines. So all right. But you can see how you can get in there nice and tight with those tiny lines. If I try a little harder, I can get a lot finer lines, but I'm afraid they wouldn't show up on camera. So black is a little bit more aggressive, so this is gonna take just a little bit longer to clean out. How are we doing on time, Taylor?
It is 5:28, so a little over 30 minutes.
Okay. Thanks. I see it. I don't know why. It seems like I blew through things a lot faster than I did yesterday. I was doing this with only about 20 minutes left yesterday.
Yeah, I don't know. I think it's a good thing.
Did I skip overs?
I don't think so.
Yeah,
I think you're doing. Somebody says it's very interesting. I'm new to airbrushing and I'm learning a lot just by looking. I will need to practice afterwards.
Well, you're more than welcome, like I said, to get a hold of me on the Discord. Talk, etc. I really don't have much of a social media presence. It's just one of them things. But practice is the thing. I'm trying to show you ways that you can practice without feeling like you're wasting paint. You know, that the paper. If you want to color the paper without using paint, use food coloring. And how many times did you work on a technique with a hairbrush before it started working for you? Same idea with an airbrush. So here we're going to do a little bit stronger. But notice I'm just kind of just noodling in these little range areas a little bit. We can do a couple of spots. It doesn't matter. I got a little splat right there, but that's okay. It's not going to matter. It's your demon. You paint it the way you like. So I'm just kind of Bob Rossing it up. Somebody looks at you and says, "Well, that's not the right coloring." Say, prove it. Find me a Lord of Hell. All right, let's go ahead and do a top layer then. And then what that's going to end up doing is shifting everything. Let's see how it turns out. I've never done it before with these hydrous watercolors on a figure before. I usually use those hydrous colors on an illustration. So, see how it works. Of course, it's going to happen. It's going to explode. Last year, after the success of these classes that I did at ReaperCon, I suddenly had all these grand, glorious dreams of, trying to stream some of this stuff on Twitch and trying to come up with all these things. And yeah, I never bothered. Deep red rose versus monochrome magenta. Let's do deep red rose. It's funny, after I started figuring out all this color layering stuff, I've got tons of paint. I got a wall of paint, and now I use probably about 6 colors. I got a ton of paint that I can just get rid of. The other thing with mixing colors that you'll find, rather than using pre-mixed colors, is if you get all of your colors out of mixes, you'll end up having a little bit of color harmony. That's a little bit more purple than I was hoping for. That'll work though. You'll end up having more color harmony in your paints. So now we're just going to dust this on the top here. And it has more purple than I was hoping for. Hoping for more of that. That's okay. We end up going again with these transparents, and it covered up that yellow too much. However, you can still see the green showing through. Do it not quite so heavy in here so you can see it. This will show up in camera a little bit better. So that ends up kind of pushing everything back. And it's going to be shiny. Let's see if I can see it. Just make sure I turn off my light. Let's see it. Yeah, it's not going to show.
It's a little dark, yeah.
Yeah. I said I took it out of low light mode. So what it does is it ends up pushing those colors back because you've layered on top of it, and then shifting them a little bit according to the color wheel. And I know there's some shine on there. Let's see if I can brush aside. Wonder if I can. Ends up getting a nice flesh modeling look to it, or winged modeling, where it ends up just tying everything kind of together like that. And you can layer on other colors on top of it. Like I use a ton of this let's do this real quick. I use a ton of this transparent tie-in brown. Let's see what happens if we just get just a little bit of that on there. This transparent tie-in brown it just ties everything together. It's like Lebowski's rug. this tie-in brown, and there's a golden tie-in as well. It's just a wonderful color.
Says it looks great. There's a veiny aspect I wasn't expecting.
Yeah, well, that's the whole idea, is to get these veins out of it. You really can't do that easily with a hairbrush. All right, let's use the Vex for this one. I want a bigger nozzle. I show you yesterday's that I did with Reaper paints. And that one you can see a little bit more modeling on there. The way it ended up speckling and modeling along through there. And that's just yellow, blue, and then that just a transparent red on top of that. I end up using a lot of this transparent tie-in brown. This is it's just a wonderful color. It's just kind of a, well, just a transparent grayish brown. I'll see if I can see it on this paper like that. So it's not really a brown. It's kind of a grayish brown. See that? Maybe it's a little stark. Let's see if I can get my corner of my paper here. See that? Not really wanting to attack the paper. It's very watery. It's almost like an ink itself. But
I'd say it's
kind
a
of
little,
grayish,
yeah, can't quite see
it's
it.
just kind of a grayish brown, but it's a real light color. You end up just kind of hosing that on there. Like that. It'll gloss it up, but it ends up just kind of bringing things together. Notice how it brought out that red? And it knocked back the purple of that red, just kind of brought it out. Bit of a gloss color until it dries, but can you see that? How it just brings that red out?
Yeah, that looks good.
Like yesterday's, just kind of hose it on there. And it just, I don't know what unicorn fart is in this color, but it just, like I said, I love this, and I love there's a golden filter color as well that he has that it just brings everything together. I mean, it's a perfect name, tie-in brown. It ties everything together. Also really hard to show on camera. Let me see if I can, I've got a couple of finished pieces over here. Let's see if I can show a few examples of that. What kind of questions we got while I do a clean on this? Anything? Come on, anything? Comments, questions, snide remarks?
I mean, I'm full of snide remarks, but probably wouldn't be very appropriate. Somebody did say it looks more red now. Before it was somewhat golden before.
Yeah. Yeah, like
But
I
yeah,
say, it just that tie-in brown just brings things together. I don't know what it is.
I say I'm liking this one better than yesterday's.
Yeah.
I think it looks better.
Yeah, I agree. Let me grab one of my favorite pieces. I'm kind of a fan of Cthulhu. And so one of my favorite pieces that I did was one of the early Reaper Bones Cthulhus. And it was just because I got to play around with all this flesh modeling and all this noodling, and all that's really hot on the light. And of course it's broken and it comes apart now. So maybe since I can bring it apart.
Somebody did ask, what was the manufacturer for the brown you mentioned? So apologies, I showed up late.
This is, it's from Garage Kits US Colors. Yeah, Garage Kits Colors.us, something like that. The link to him is on my Discord in the Artist Alley. This is labeled Freestyle Lifetone. That's the old manufacturer. He's taken over the thing. I ended up buying a case of this stuff when I fell in love with the color, so I just keep it. But it's a taxidermy paint. Even though there's a weird guy on the cover there, but it's made by Garage Kits Colors US, and just transparent tie-in brown. I use that, and like I say, that the golden filter I use a ton of too. I got that handy. No, I don't. All right, so there's Cthulhu's arm, and you see all the veining and all that fun modeling that I get in there with just, and there's, I think I did this with 3 colors, maybe 2. All of Cthulhu, this whole thing, that's 3 colors. And I just, 3 colors plus white, I should say. So 4 technically. But I ended up getting all of these various colors on that. And so you can just see all this deep veining that I'd get in there, you know, and that's just so difficult to do with a hairbrush, and it just ends up giving so much depth to your models. This was all painted strictly with an airbrush. Even though those little veins in there, I masked those off. I challenged myself to do this fully with an airbrush, I should say, but get all that modeling in there. This is a figure I'm working on right now. It's a Baron Harkonnen from Todd Carolyn. Let's see if I can get the, not quite so hot. There we go. You can see those deep, nasty veins on his head. And we've got all these separating wounds that I'm starting to work on. And see how much more depth there is to it when you can layer these paints instead of blending them like you do with a traditional hairbrush. It just provides so much more visual interest, in my opinion. And Jesse at Garage Kits, he also sells a full line of the Harder and Steenbeck airbrushes too. Get all the parts, everything like that. He's got compressors, etc. All right, what other questions can I answer? I don't want to end, 15 minutes. Well, I guess it's only 15 minutes. That's not so bad. There's got to be other stuff we can talk about. Hope you all learned something. I guess I can actually look at the chat now. Thinking, okay. Well, there's got to be something.
I was about to say, somebody earlier said a Snyder. Yeah, Snyder marks if you don't want your wall of paints. I know a good home.
Like I said, once you learn some of these secrets, you're not going to need them.
Oh, see, there you go. And yeah, looking forward to using the brush on Tiamat and the other large dragons.
Yeah, see that any of these organics, these big demons, these dragons, that's where all of this stuff is so much fun.
Sorry, I had to come in a little late and apologize if this was already covered. When using primer, do you spray at about 30 psi and add any thinner or flow improver? Also, what is your favorite brand of airbrush?
So
yeah.
My favorite brand of airbrush is Iwata, and I think that's just because you never forget your first. And that's my first airbrush, and I still use it. It's an Iwata Eclipse side bottle, and it's just an absolute workhorse airbrush. It has never failed me.
And then, yeah, somebody asked how should a IWOC beginner think about PSI?
So again, that triangle. Remember that triangle of PSI, paint viscosity, and how close you are to your object. So play around with it. I always start between 10 and 20 PSI. So, 12, give yourself a figure in there, say 15. So then thin your paint enough so that 15 works for you. I start with right around 2% milk, go thinner from there as I need to, and then how close you are to your substrate. So you use that distance there to get in those nice fine lines, get in those nice edges, those nice feathered edges, everything like that. If you thin it, if you start at 15 psi and it's spattering, well, then you know that your viscosity isn't quite right, or that your distance isn't quite right. If you need to pull the brush back or forward, then you can also adjust your psi to compensate for that. There's a lot of different ways. Somebody had mentioned 30 psi. That is a lot higher than I spray at. Like I say, I only spray about 10 to 20 tops. The higher the psi you've got, the more air you're pushing out, and the more it's going to impact that surface, and it's going to bounce that pigment off if it doesn't adhere. It's going to dry your paint faster. A lot of other issues. You're going to have more overspray. You're going to put more paint into the atmosphere. You're going to use up more paint that way, etc. So I always spray a lot lighter. Primers. Somebody mentioned Stynylrez primer. I use Stynylrez as well. I don't have any loyalty to any one brand paint, one brand primer, anything along those lines. I use Stynylrez because it was the new hotness a few years ago. I use Vallejo's surface primer. I use a lot of different paints. I use Garage Kits primers. The main thing you want to get out of a primer is the mechanical adhesion of your paint to your substrate, and so your primer is that job. And so you want to make sure that it just matches up with whatever it is you're painting. I don't think Stynylrez is necessarily the best primer. It works, but it's airbrush ready. It can have a problem with it clumping up and clogging, but there is a BB at the bottom of this, and so just shake it a lot. I know some people will grab it off of the shelf after it's been sitting there for a year, shake it like that, and then say, okay, we're ready to go. No. Shake it a lot. You shake it until your arm falls off, and then put your arm back on and shake it a little bit more. You're not going to hurt anything by really shaking it. You can introduce some air and some bubbling and stuff like that by shaking it, but so just letting it set for a minute or so, and you'll be fine. But don't be afraid to shake your paints. You can roll it back and forth, you know, that little BB in there, do it like that, etc. I also use spray can primer. I use Rust-Oleum a lot. I use the Gunze Mr. Surfacer primers. If I'm trying to prime something that's real small and I don't want to use my spray can of Tamiya fine surface primer, you can take a straw. Let's see if I can show how to do this real quick. You can take a straw with a can of spray paint. Let's all pretend that, let's pretend that this can of spray paint, this is Mr. Resin Primer Surfacer from Gunze Fangio. Let's pretend that this pipette is actually a straw. So you put it on the front end over that nozzle right there, and then spray it into a cup, either something like this or an old film canister, if you remember what film is. And you'll want to tape it off because it'll spray everywhere. But you let it outgas for a minute or so. It'll get the propellants out of there, and just let it come out. It might bubble a little bit, etc. Get it out of there, and then you can use that same pipette to put it in your airbrush cup and then spray that. I've done that a lot. That works great. But I use a lot of spray can primers. They're a little hotter. They seem to etch the plastic that you've got. So
You've got like 4 more questions, by the way.
Okay.
Can you use metallic paints with an airbrush?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. The problems with metallics is, since they're particulates, they're larger particulates. They want to act like sandpaper on your needle and nozzle. So let's see. I don't have an acrylic metallic in front of me. I use these metallics right here. These all-clad lacquers, which means they're nasty. They're enough to really stink up your room. So I don't use them with this little booth bong that I've got. Excuse me. I use them outside. But they're a very, very finely ground metallic. Let me show. I shook this up yesterday. Taylor can attest. I shook this up yesterday, and you can already see that it's already settled down.
Yeah.
But it's a very, very finely ground metallic, and so it lays down. The secret with your metallics is you've got particles that all want to lay in one direction to be shiny. Like for chrome, for example, you want all those particles to be laying the exact same direction, so they all act like little mirrors to reflect back to you. And all clad just seems to lay down very, very nicely. You spray this at very, very low PSI too. I think I spray this at like 10. I mean, very, very, very low PSI, even lower than that. I also don't use my good airbrushes to spray metallics, just because it etches everything. I'll use my Eclipse, but I'll use an old needle and a nozzle, for example. And sometimes you've got to use a little bit heavier nozzle, like a 0.5, just so that it can get that particulate out. All clad I don't have a problem with, but like the Tamiya metallics, I do. I don't. I've switched over to these all clads rather than the Tamiya or the Gunze or Vallejos or anything like that, because you've got to thin those out to get them to run through an airbrush. And if you thin them out, then you're increasing the amount of binder in there versus pigment, the pigment to binder ratio, and so that can alter the way the metallic looks when it goes down.
And then suggestions for first compressor, model, brand, how to select.
Well,
website.
so the best compressor is the one that you can get. I use an Iwata Smart Jet Pro. It was about three something. I think they're a little cheaper now, but it's over 15 years old, and it just runs like a champ. It only runs when you actually press the trigger, so it runs a lot cooler than a normal compressor, and so it just doesn't seem to wear out. I've also got friends that have 20-year-old Badger compressors, and they've just never had any problem as well. I like compressors that either have a tank or a long hose with them somehow that takes up the pulse, because you've got a diaphragm or you've got a piston that's going to be moving back and forth to compress that air, and it's going to introduce a little bit of a pulsation in that line. And so you can get a cheaper starter compressor like this Iwata Ninja that it ends up running constantly. But to get the pulsing out, they've got this really long line, this really long air hose to try to absorb some of that. And it does pretty good, but if I'm trying to pull a really tiny line, like with that hard-earned steam deck, you can actually see the pulsation in the line. I don't notice it so much on the other one, but it also doesn't have a actual PSI gauge. You got to kind of just do it by feel with this plus or minus thing. And there's no water trap on it. So you end up putting a water trap right here on the end, water and dust trap as a pistol grip filter. It works, but I prefer spending just a little bit more money and getting a little bit better compressor. If you want to get a shop compressor, those work great too. You can just fill up the tanks and then turn off the compressor and spray off of that, and then you don't hear the motor turning up. My Iwata compressor, I don't even know if you guys heard it. It's right next to over here, but it's only about as noisy as a refrigerator. So it's very, very quiet. And so I can spray. At my old house, I had a bedroom right above my workshop with my kids when they were infants, and they never heard it at all. So I could paint all night, and nobody would know that that's what I was doing. It was great. So buy a decent compressor. The cheaper compressors will not go really high PSI. I think my Smart Jet only goes out to about 35 PSI or so, but I don't need anything more than that. One is like I say, I spray at very low pressures. You would spray, if you were spraying T-shirts or something like that, that's when you'd have to get a higher pressure compressor, because you want the particles. The reason why we don't want the high pressure on a model, you do on a T-shirt, because you want that air to push those particles into that fabric and get it to stay. So what else we got?
Do you thin your primers at all?
Not generally, because I generally spray with a thicker nozzle, like a 0.5 needle, or just a larger nozzle. So I don't generally thin them. You can, but I generally don't.
And then I bought my compressor the other day off Amazon. It was advertised as an airbrush compressor, but it doesn't seem to go below 20 PSI. Does that mean I should return it and look for something different?
So you can do a couple of things. If it's truly an airbrush compressor, it should go below that. If it's a rebadged shop compressor that just runs constantly and won't go lower than that, you can do a couple of things. You can they make regulators that will a real fine adjustment regulator. The problem with that is, depending on the compressor, it may not shut off, and so all it's going to do is build up a lot of pressure on the other side of the regulator, and you're going to have problems. But if it's a genuine airbrush compressor, it should go lower than that. If it doesn't, then it's not a genuine airbrush compressor, and probably return it.
And that's all. So thanks for all the tips and info, Dan. I really enjoyed the class.
Well, you're very welcome. I hope you did get something out of it. I do enjoy this and enjoy airbrushing, and I enjoy teaching too. So I genuinely hope you did get something out of it. I hope this whole ReaperCon was successful for everybody. I didn't get to take nearly as many classes as I had hoped to, so I'm going to go watch everything on the replay when it shows up in a couple of months. But
let's say Arcos looks like it won again for this poll.
Come on, Cyberus. Geez.
I know. Let's see, but we had a good turnout for this one. Said thank you so much. This has been great.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
I got to advertise my daughter's school. She goes to Drexel University. So go Dragons. She's out in Philadelphia.
Dragons are the best.
That's right.
All right.
Okay. Well, if there's nothing else, then I guess we'll
stop recording.